Love podcasts, ain't nonsense. It's a Politics JOE podcast. Thank you. Hi, Laura.
Hello, Ava. How are you?
Well, I'm great now that you're back.
Oh, thank you.
It's completely fallen apart here. Should we say where you were?
Yeah, I was in Romania. I was in Bucharest, which was very interesting. Very interesting place to be. Lots of posters of Donald Trump up there, saying "Make Romania Great Again," which I guess is kind of related to what we're going to talk about today.
When do you think that Romania was last entwined with the sort of American policies? You know, when were they? What Romania are they trying to get back to?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Ceausescu's? I'm not sure. What do they mean by great again?
Yeah. Oh, aren't we snobby? I meant more like, you know, when have they ever been sort of hyper-capitalist?
That's a good point.
But I don't know. Maybe it can be Trump's new Riviera.
Could be property development opportunities there.
I wonder if he likes real concrete infrastructure.
Well, I mean, he has been interfering in Romania with getting them to release Andrew Tate. So he does have some form of interest in Romania. Yeah.
Do you think that's what Tate was advising him on? What you can do in Romania?
Where's the best place to build?
All right, Laura, we meet in the morning after the night before. Mm-hmm. The night before, the US suspended all military aid to Ukraine post-Trump-Zelensky row. There was this sort of extraordinary Truth Social post that Trump posted yesterday, which should I just read it for the benefit of the listener?
Yes,
if you
please. Haven't
seen this, Donald Trump doubled down on his argument with Zelensky. He said he screen grabbed. It doesn't say where the news has come from. It doesn't stipulate what source this is, but it's a news article that says Ukraine Zelensky says end of war with Russia is very, very far away, and a picture of Zelensky looking very disappointed or forlorn. And Trump has said, this is the worst statement that could have been made by Zelensky, and America will not put up with it for much longer. It is what I was saying. This guy doesn't want to be there. Doesn't want there to be peace as long as he has America's backing. And Europe, in the meeting they had with Zelensky, stated flatly that they cannot do the job without the US. Probably not a great statement to have been made in terms of a show of strength against Russia. What are they thinking?
I mean, they're trying to frame Zelensky like he is the aggressor in all of this. Like he wants a forever war, rather than what he's made quite clear is that he's actually ready to sign the mineral deal, but he would like a US security guarantee to come with that, which I would argue is negotiation. But Trump and Vance are arguing that he's just not ready to negotiate. He doesn't want to come to the table. Because I think in their minds, negotiation is perhaps just strong-arming Zelensky into doing what they'd like. Why do you think that we're seeing the US align themselves with Russia's interests over perhaps Europe and Ukraine's?
Well, I think that's a very broad question, and that's more of a thinker question, I would have to say. What I do think is there is what we saw overnight was this JD Vance interview. And in that, he sort of does lay bare that this is a cash grab for the US, right? And they are not going to pull back from this potential mineral deal that they would like in Ukraine. I mean, the terms of that deal are extraordinary. Like, you know, when we first saw the leaked document, it was pretty much like the summation of it was Ukraine will feed America before it feeds themselves. You know, they will pay back America for this contested $350 billion loan. Are we now calling it a loan? I mean, we can just use any word, can't we? Because even the figure in itself is fictitious, right? Mm-hmm. There's no, even the more generous analysts say it's nearer to sort of 170, 180 billion. But why 350 is always the figure, right? This is like the red bus again. Mm-hmm. 350 is always the figure. I was actually on Politics Live before we get into the Vance interview. I was on Politics Live yesterday, and I'll put the clip in here. You just ignore me because you don't need to. What I'm saying is irrelevant. But this is the former ambassador to Ukraine under Trump, under the last administration. And I thought what he had to say was very interesting.
Because we've seen a land grab in Ukraine, and now we're seeing a cash grab from the Americans. I mean, it seems
it doesn't quite seem right to me that perhaps we would send
I hope I
European...
can respond to this.
Yeah, I will give you a chance. Let Ava finish her point.
I don't quite agree with you with sending European troops to defend a border which is essentially going to be American interests. I think, if you are going to be taking, 50% of whatever their value of minerals, then surely it should be American troops on the ground. I'm not even sure why we're involved in the conversation if that's the way things are going to play out.
Right, well, Gordon, this is a cash grab, and it should be US troops there if you want to defend your interests.
It's not a cash grab. It's an enormous cash infusion by Americans. Yes, there will be some profits from the minerals, but I think what President Trump is envisioning is a massive investment in Ukraine, which will also help to rebuild. So if the Europeans think we're getting too good of a deal, they should join us.
But he believes that the cash has already been delivered to Ukraine. I don't believe he said anything about providing extra funds. He says, we've already given you $350 billion and we'd like to see that back.
Which isn't a real figure, but anyway, yeah. Gordon?
Well, listen to what Treasury Secretary Bessent says. And it's very, very clear that the goal is not simply to repay us for whatever the number is, and I'm not going to litigate the number here on this program.
No.
But it's to do what the Ukrainians asked of me when I was ambassador in 2018. They came and wanted tremendous American investment support from American investment banks. They want a better bond rating. They want all of those things. And once America takes the lead in supplying that, Putin isn't going to touch Ukraine because he knows he's taking a direct...
That it's an American protectorate.
Position.
Right,
essentially.
Well, exactly.
Okay, so that last little line he has there where I ask him, this is so vain to speak about it like this, like, when I did this. I ask him, will this make Ukraine an American protectorate? And he says, exactly. I find that quite sinister.
Definitely. I mean, it's like the Telegraph, when they initially broke the story with the terms of the deals, they called it a form of, was it economic colonialism?
Yeah.
And it is that. And I think what was interesting in that JD Vance interview was where he said the very best security guarantee is to give Americans an economic upside in the future of Ukraine. And interestingly, that is the point that Farage made in Parliament yesterday, when he said that he also said that would be the best way to, is that not enough of a security assurance? Why do we need peacekeeping troops? And I thought it was interesting because when Russia invaded Ukraine, there were already US companies and US economic interests at play in Ukraine, and that didn't stop them from invading.
Should we put that clip in here?
Yes.
It may be a great irony that a Remainer Prime Minister used Brexit freedoms as effectively as he did yesterday. Indeed, as Number 10 briefed, we are now in a unique position compared to the rest of Europe, and yesterday was a triumph. I also applaud him making such positive words about President Trump and our relationship with America, even if nobody behind him agrees. But here's the key. President Zelensky has now accepted that he's going to sign the minerals agreement with America. And America's going to put in $100 billion or whatever it is, and thousands of Americans will be in Ukraine. Is that of itself enough of a security guarantee? No. Or does it mean that we need to send British troops? And if we do, given the size of our army, how many?
The mineral deal is not enough on its own. But can I just remind him, Russia is the aggressor. Zelensky is a war leader whose country has been invaded. And we should all be supporting him and not fawning over Putin.
Booed he was, wasn't he, yesterday?
I wonder who that plays well with domestically, that sort of message. Because
Farage's message or the chamber reaction?
Farage's message.
Right. Yeah, I think it's difficult because we're always a little bit behind the Americans, right? When you're watching that Vance interview yesterday, watched it this morning, you can see what base he's playing to, right? He's like, his entire argument is, we'll get into the sort of the double speak of that interview in a moment. But his argument is always, this is for the American people. The American people want this. They can't afford this. And there's such succinct, short little sound bites that do resonate well because in the abstract, you go, well, yeah, actually the Americans can't keep funding a war for the next 20, 30 years. But he's having an entirely different conversation to what is actually going on geopolitically.
Definitely. And I think that the funding of the war in Ukraine is definitely the point that people who are against funding it use as, well, this is going to cost the taxpayer more money. But because JD Vance made that point in the interview, he said, we're giving hundreds of millions to Ukraine and the American people are not happy. But since January 2022, the US has given, and this is to the Kiel Institute's estimate, about $119.7 billion to Ukraine. In 2023 alone, the US military spent $820 billion. So funding the war in Ukraine isn't even 15% of that budget. They could half their military spend and still easily fund the war in Ukraine without costing the saving the taxpayer money. So the spend argument is interesting to me. And obviously at home, well, to fill in the gap that the US is leaving by withdrawing its military spending in Ukraine, every other country will have to double its current military support. And to do this, Keir Starmer ruled out changing the fiscal rules to fund defence spending around borrowing, which is what he was asked yesterday about in the chamber. But 65% of British public support cutting aid spending to fund defence. So I think because he's managed to fund defence without, having to cut any domestic spending, and without having to increase borrowing, it has been quite a popular decision.
But we don't know if that's even true yet, because we haven't had the spending review. And I was talking to actually a couple of Labour MPs yesterday. I was just milling about Parliament and I was chatting away, and they said the figures don't add up on their estimations. They're saying that when it comes to the spending review, they think there's actually going to be a lot of domestic hard choices that will be made. And they can imagine a scenario where Rachel Reeves does actually go further and cuts the welfare budget, puts harsher ties on DWP. And that totally makes sense, because if you look at the sort of clever accounting that they did to, subtract some of the aid spending and increase defence, Starmer admitted in the chamber during PMQs last week that some of that money is ring-fenced to repurchase parts of the Chagos Islands. So it really is sort of like creative in where they're moving the figures. How much new money has actually been allocated towards the Ukraine effort, we're not sure on, we're not clear on, because everything is quite muddied and do you know what I mean? It's all muddled together.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because even if Europe could, and they can, outspend Russia, so the French and Germans already outspend Russia by 50%, and that's a much smaller percentage of their GDP. The EU economically is 12 times larger than Russia as well. So even though we can outspend them on military, remains this question about our industrial capacity to produce, because the EU was already behind on meeting its targets to provide munitions to Russia. So I guess one of the biggest problems with the US withdrawing its military aid is actually just in terms of pure industrial capacity. Interestingly, Stephen Flynn asked if the US would stop military aid yesterday in the chamber, and Starmer said this wasn't the US position. Do you think that Starmer was a bit blindsided, or will have been blindsided by the news that came out overnight?
I think we were all blindsided, weren't we? It's a rather extreme move to halt all aid. Going back to what you had to say about spend there, it works in the UK's favour, right, to increase spending, but it worked in its favour for possibly like a brief fleeting moment. That brief fleeting moment when he met Donald Trump. None of that seems to have come out in the wash. I actually there were a couple of senators yesterday talking about the UK, and they were saying that we were still the only big player in Europe, which is rather unfair on Germany when you think about like how much they've spent.
And France.
The question in the Commons yesterday that was posed by a number of MPs, including Stephen Flynn, it wasn't questioning whether we should be sending or raising extra finances, extra capital to send to Ukraine. That's not the question. The question is about this special relationship that we have with the United States and whether we're overplaying or over-relying on what is essentially a fictitious relationship in order to sort of like keep keep the peace or save face, because there's a lot of questions around how much we do rely on the US, and it's not actually just in a backstop capacity in the way that Keir Starmer was talking about it. We have a nuclear deterrent that is operated, or looked after, I suppose, by the Americans. We assume it's around £100 billion, this piece of nuclear equipment, and that is operated essentially by the Americans, and they could withdraw that at any point in time. That's not a backstop. That's actually like having, daddy is actually overseeing our defense. And then it sort of bleeds into this whole other question that I guess is sort of ruminating around, particularly with some people like Nigel Farage, but actually kind of ruminating now around Labour MPs. Like, are we actually sovereign as a nation? Are we actually able to, not that we have to right now, but park that, but are we actually able to defend our borders or act in a sovereign manner at this point in time? And Trump has provoked that question, and the answer is frankly no.
I think it's what Ed Davey was asking as well, which is the US an unreliable ally? And I think if you're looking at where our national interests align and who they align with, I'm not sure with how much confidence you could say our national interest is with the US. In fact, it looks like it's a lot more in line with the EU and other European countries. And on the point of the special relationship, I mean, you kind of saw JD Vance embarrass the UK by saying in that interview that you mentioned that he said he was talking about the British and French peacekeeping troops, which is, this plan that Starmer and Macron want to present to the US.
That Starmer didn't seem to know that much about. Macron seemed a bit more on the paper with that, yeah.
And JD Vance said, it's just 20k troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years, which is quite brutal to refer to the UK as some random country who hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years when you consider that we went blindly and followed them into Iraq and Afghanistan, and how many British service people died fighting those American wars. And the irony of saying that the EU or the European countries get some sort of benefit from NATO that the US doesn't get, when the only country ever to have triggered Article 5 of NATO is the US in the wake of 9/11.
It's really, it's quite bully boy behaviour.
It's definitely bullying behaviour.
And it's very difficult because it's like there's part of me when I'm looking and when I'm listening to Vance and I think, God, this is such top line stuff. It's almost as if he doesn't quite know what he's talking about. And so he sort of just clicked on little bits of sound bites or whatever. And he's come up with this, this sort of argument. But then there's the other side of me that thinks, well, perhaps this is actually rather sinister. And everything that he was doing in that interview was an attempt to belittle European allies. I mean, even like he would say something really disparaging about the EU, but he would begin with our allies, our friends. They they are our friends, but also like they can have their silly little meeting if they'd like to have it, and it actually really doesn't bear a lot of relevance to us. I'm not even entirely sure that he knew what went down in that meeting. Does he know? Has he been briefed? Does he care?
It feels like foreign policy by male ego, and the question of how much do they actually know about the conflict in Ukraine, I think, was proven during the meeting with Zelensky, where Donald Trump tried to correct Zelensky about what year the invasion of Crimea happened. And Zelensky, said, well, actually it was 2014, even though Trump was trying to correct him on that. And it did feel like they've got a little double act going on with this desire to humiliate European leaders. Because I think actually you saw JD Vance tried to do the same thing to Keir Starmer. It felt quite calculated when he asked Keir Starmer, said something along the lines of, well, you don't really have free speech in Britain. And Starmer was able to diffuse that question. But the way that JD Vance was jumping in and questioning Zelensky, it felt like the same tactic. They've got a little double act going on. But it did remind me of the way that we know Trump acted as a businessman, which was reckless and vengeful. I mean, he had an apartment in New York, which he had rent-controlled residents in, and to get them out of his building, which he wanted to redevelop, he cut off their water and heating, allegedly. And that's just...
Starmer would like him then.
Yeah, it's the strong-arming behaviour that we saw him use in business. He's now trying to apply to international diplomacy.
It definitely does feel vengeful, because the sort of the thing that really got his back up during that Zelensky meeting was the Biden administration, that stupid man who continued to fund this war in Ukraine. It almost, and there was definitely, you could feel the tension around Zelensky having gone and campaigned for the Democrats. That has really sat with him. It's like that's like really sitting on his frontal lobe there, and he just cannot remove it
When
from
he
his
brought
mind.
when he brought that up when he said that line during the conversation, I suddenly went, oh, this is what this is about.
Right.
And then we saw in the interview that with Sean Hannity that he was reframing how that argument had started.
Should we play it?
We should play it.
Let's go back to the Oval Office Friday.
Yep.
From your perspective.
Yeah, great TV, as the president said. Yeah, well, it's funny. So we have a 45-minute press conference, and the president normally does this. I mean, I've seen this now 3 or 4 times with foreign leaders, where he likes to bring the media in, likes to have a conversation, but answer questions with the press. As you know, he's very open with reporters. And what I noticed is that for the first 25, 30 or so minutes, he tried to sort of bend over backwards to be gracious and kind to Zelensky, even when Zelensky was kind of needling him, even when Zelensky was saying things that I thought were untrue. The president just tried to be diplomatic, right? I think that's his natural instinct in that situation. And then when it really went off the rails, of course, is when I asked, or you had a Polish journalist who asked a question, the president answered it, and then I answered it, and then something about my answer just really set Zelensky off. So then he came at me.
So you're blaming yourself.
And then I went back at him,
right.
And what I tried to do originally was actually try to diffuse the situation a little bit, because I'm like, we're having this meeting. Obviously, there are 100 television cameras here. Let's try to have this conversation in private. And then the president, as we kept on going back and forth, I tried again to say, well, maybe we should have this conversation in private. And the president was like, nope, actually, I don't want to have it in private anymore. I want to have this actual conversation in public for the American people to see. And I do think that there was just a certain sense of, there was a lack of respect. There was a certain sense of entitlement. And most importantly, look, we can look past all of that stuff, but the president has set a very clear goal for his administration. He wants the killing to stop. And I think that it's very important that President Zelensky and of course President Putin too, they've both got to come to the negotiating table, and that's ultimately where things broke apart. I really don't care what President Zelensky says about me or anybody else, but he showed a clear unwillingness to engage in the peace process that President Trump has said is the policy of the American people and of their president. That's the real breakdown, is I think Zelensky wasn't yet there, and I think frankly now still isn't there, but I think he'll get there eventually. He has to.
I'm not sure that is what we saw happen. I mean, what I saw was Zelensky present him with the question, how is what Putin's doing diplomacy? And JD Vance totally unable to answer that. So he just goes on the attack with, well, you haven't said thank you.
There was something very odd about his facial movements and his demeanor during that interview there. It's he's almost mocking. He's sort of laughing at what went on. And it's a very kind of... It's very bizarre to talk about, because you've seen 2 different scenes, right? You saw the scene in the Oval Office, and now you're watching this interview. Those two things could be about totally different events. I don't know what JD Vance is talking about during that interview, but it's certainly not that meeting with Zelensky, because he brings up how a Polish journalist asked a question, and then he sort of laughs in this quite like kind of Cheshire Cat sort of way and says, and I was just answering the question, and then, there was Zelensky, just getting, all riled up over nothing. And you think, Americans will buy this. Americans will believe this, because it's not, it shouldn't be too, how do I phrase this properly? When the vice president is telling you something, you shouldn't have to automatically assume that they're lying. Mm-hmm. But clearly during that interview, there was some obfuscation.
Yeah, I mean, even at the very beginning of that interview, we saw JD Vance saying that Donald Trump is really good with journalists. He really supports the free press, when we know just last week he's now banned the AP from entering the White House. So I think, and I mean, we saw this completely during the first Donald Trump presidency, which was just out and out lying. But the polarization is so extreme that they can just get away with that and there is no accountability.
Yes. Did you see the piece the New York Times ran about Doge and about the inaccuracies with what they were reporting had been cut from the budget? It's extraordinary. They just so Doge posted the top 5 cuts that they had made to taxpayer spend, government spend, and they're all totally inaccurate. But they're not even slightly, they are wildly off the mark. I mean, the top one, it was about an ICE cut, and Doge said that they'd cut $8 billion from that budget. Turns out what they'd actually cut was around 8 million, and 8 billion is the entire budget for ICE. It's totally fictitious. And then these were quietly wiped off of Doge's website and then replaced with new figures that the New York Times just went back again and was like, wrong. It kind of feels sort of like government by bluster or government by deception, because I suppose if you can communicate the message that you're doing all of these things, then that wipes out any responsibility to actually have to do them. And while I'm on it as well, actually, there were some brilliant other cuts. Things that were cut under Biden, things that hadn't operated since 2005 under Bush. I mean, this guy was just plucking figures, out of, midair. It was extraordinary.
It is interesting. And I wonder if the turning point at which will happen with the American people will be when they feel the economic consequences of this in their own pockets. Because there was quite an interesting piece by Grace Blakely, where she was writing about how the cuts specifically to US federal aid and all the job losses that came with that, hundreds and hundreds of job losses, alongside the implementation of the tariffs, which we're going to see come into effect today, could cause a recession in the US economy. And I wonder if that would be the turning point at which people maybe realize that actually this reckless sort of cutting that we're seeing isn't the best.
But will we see that, though? Or will we see it's because we're sending all of that money to Ukraine? Is that the argument they'll make?
Yeah, I think it definitely will be.
Yeah. Should we watch a little bit more of that JD Vance interview?
Yeah.
Here's the problem with the Europeans. And a lot of these guys are our friends. They're our allies. We, of course, the president has a great relationship with a lot of European heads of state, and so do I, but they need to be realistic. And the craziest part about this, Sean, is that sometimes you'll have European heads of state who in public will puff up their chest and say, we're in it with President Zelensky for the next 10 years. And then in private, they'll pick up the phone and say, this can't go on forever. He has to come to the negotiating table. So I honestly don't care what the Europeans say in public. What I care is what they say in private. And what they need to be saying to President Zelensky is, this can't go on forever. The bloodshed, the killing, the economic devastation, it's making everyone worse off. The only pathway to, I think, back to peace and prosperity is what the president is trying to accomplish.
And now we look back in time and we see Joe Biden was beginning to understand that the patience of the American people is running thin.
That's right.
Hundreds of billions of dollars. We're a nation with nearly 40 trillion in debt.
Yep.
I mean, it's too much.
Well, Sean, this is an important point, though, because I was a United States Senator, for the last 2 years of the Biden administration. I got elected in 2022.
I think you like this job better?
I think I like this job a lot better. I certainly like the president a lot better. And here's the thing, when you would talk to the Biden administration officials in private, this is another example of a terrible situation the Biden admin left the Trump administration. When you ask them what's the plan, okay, we're going to spend tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars in Ukraine. What is your plan? And they would honestly tell you, well, we're just going to send them weapons for as long as we can and hope eventually they can turn the tide. Hope is not a strategy. Throwing money and ammunition at a terrible conflict, that is not a strategy. The only guy in town with a strategy is the President of the United States, and everybody needs to follow his lead.
What scares me is Zelensky, when he says it's going to go on for years, how many more lives are going to be lost? He's not going to have a country to save at the end of that. The minerals deal would have provided the monies to rebuild their country and a strong U.S. presence and maybe European troops as well.
And this is an important part of it. The president knows that, look, if you want real security guarantees, if you want to actually ensure that Vladimir Putin does not invade Ukraine again, the very best security guarantee is to give Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. That is a way way better security guarantee than 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years. The security guarantee and also the economic guarantee for Ukraine is to rebuild the country and ensure that America has a long-term interest. You're not going to do that if you come to the Oval Office, insult the president, and refuse to follow his plan for peace.
If he called, and I hate hypothetical questions.
Sure.
Forgive me. If he called tomorrow and said, I am ready to adopt your plan for peace, he can come back?
I think that if he called and had a serious proposal for how he was going to engage in the process, look, there are details that really matter that we're already working on with the Russians. We've already talked with some of our allies. He needs to engage seriously on the details. I think once that happens, then absolutely we want to talk. Are you
convinced?
Okay, so that's JD Vance there saying that Zelensky goes over to Europe. They all puff him up. They fluff him up. And they say, don't worry, we're going to continue funding you until you decide it's over. Sort of creating this idea that it's a, I mean, there is, okay, hang on, you go. I'll think about that point.
I think, yeah, I wonder if seeing the European leaders and Justin Trudeau come together in the way that they have was perhaps a trigger for this complete military aid cut from the US. Because, I mean, we saw them come together into what they've called a coalition of the willing, which I thought was a strange phrase to use because it is associated with the Iraq War, which was pretty disastrous, and no one really remembers that popularly. But I guess what maybe they're trying to invoke is a time at which the US and the UK were completely intertwined with their foreign policy, and maybe remind the US of how much the UK did support them at that time. But I wonder if that has perhaps inadvertently made the US respond in the way they have. And also I wonder if those pictures of Zelensky meeting the king, if that was, one, a deliberate message to the US, and two, if you think that message was picked up upon.
I think it's a terrible way to do diplomacy, isn't it? To essentially be like, we can't meet up in case it upsets the president of the United States. I mean, that's quite wild. I mean, yeah, of course, taking a step back, a summit of European leaders is not a good look to not have the president, present. And it's a day after this catastrophic meeting in the Oval Office. It is a bad look, but does that mean you should not do it? You're sort of walking on a tightrope with Donald Trump. He flip-flops, to say the least. It's very difficult to know which pieces of information he's actually retaining and which he's actually just saying because it makes good television in the moment. It doesn't really. It's very difficult to pinpoint a concrete plan of how he would like to see this play out. On your point about Iraq, there, I was thinking about this, about how being in the shadow of Iraq, I think, is possibly why young people here are so reticent to go to war or for this boots on the ground idea, which is overwhelmingly unpopular, according to the polls. Well, there's one poll actually that says that people are in favor of it, but I wasn't too sure about the terms of that poll. But the shadow of the Iraq war is essentially like we went into that country under the guise of peacekeeping arrangements. Yeah. And actually it was, let me try and grab what we can out of the country, right? Trump has just said that quiet bit out loud with Ukraine. He's just said, look, they've got a hell of a lot of minerals and I want them. And what I thought was interesting about that is America still thinks it should be European troops on the ground, even if they sign this minerals deal. So they think that their role in all of this is to make it Ukraine an economic prospect for America, but it will be Europeans whose blood is shed on the borders.
I also don't understand why, if they're so sure that having US economic interests in Ukraine would deter the Russians, why then can't they say, well, we'll put in a US military backstop as well? Because if they're so confident that Russia won't attack with US economic interests there, then why wouldn't they say that we will put a military backstop as well? I'm not sure about why that is.
It doesn't make any sense at all. I think in their heads, or the heads of the people who are speaking on this, it's like, well, our role is we're sort of like the overlord, Then we'll wash our hands of it. You guys deal with the morality of borders.
I think your point about how this is all happening under the shadow of Iraq is really interesting, because I think for people our age, our only memories of US wars have been Afghanistan and Iraq, which I think everyone argues were totally unjust wars with fabricated reasons for entering, especially into Iraq. And we maybe don't have a common or recent memory of more successful US interferences in war, which possibly you could include Kosovo and Kuwait in quite successful limited military operations that achieved their goal successfully and didn't destabilize the countries. And perhaps the idea of the UK or US even participating in a just war, people have lost so much faith because of Iraq and Afghanistan that they can't even imagine that actually the UK could enter some form of military intervention in a just way.
The arrangement, the terms of that arrangement, I think that's where British people become very sceptical.
I wonder, do you think, Starmer was framing himself as a bridge between Europe and the US, and he said in the Commons yesterday, we'll never choose between either side of the Atlantic. Do you think with everything that's happened, and especially with the military spending being cut overnight, that Starmer can still perform that role?
It's difficult, isn't it? Because this story changes pretty much every single day. I mean, if Trump has blindsided him and withdrawn aid or halted aid without letting the UK Prime Minister know, which I think is probably what has happened, that's a pretty clear indication that they don't have the respect for that special relationship that we over here think we have. And then there's also this other side of it, which I guess is what we were talking about at the beginning of this podcast, which is like, it does feel like a lot of bluster, this special relationship talk. I was listening to Angela Rayner on Radio 4 this morning, and she just repeated the line over and over again that our American allies this, da 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 da. It kind of almost feels like we're getting to a point where it's like almost like Mariah Carey talking about Jennifer Lopez, where she's like, I don't know her. Like, it kind of does feel a bit like that. And it sort of feels like we're only saying that to placate Donald Trump and his potential to fly off the handle. What do you think?
It's like when Ed Davey asked that question about the US being an unreliable ally. Starmer obviously couldn't say, which I think is becoming quite evident that they are unreliable, but Starmer couldn't say that because, like you said, he needs to placate the US, at least publicly, even if behind the scenes he's making movements to perhaps realign the UK more in alignment with the EU rather than the US.
Is he realigning? He's also just sort of encouraging them to spend, right? He sort of, and he'd already set the groundwork up for this anyway. You know, he'd set up that task force. He'd set up this group of civil servants, or was in the process of setting them up at least, that would negotiate with Europe. I think that the foresight of that was trade arrangements rather than the potential to go into a war. But that groundwork has actually been very helpful. You also look at the previous ambassador to the US and the groundwork that she did with the Republican Party. That has been incredibly beneficial with how we are perceived. Now in the US, a lot of countries turned their back on Donald Trump and didn't really have the foresight to engage with the Republican Party during the Biden administration. There was sort of this expectation, I think, that Harris would win the election, and no one bothered. But our ambassador did, which has sort of paved the way for Peter Mandelson to now make hay. Although he really surprised everyone with that extraordinary intervention on Ukraine. And what I mean by it surprised everyone is it surprised no one, because Peter Mandelson just loves to get involved. He just loves it. So main character. Well, there's a lot more we could talk about, but we'll leave it there.
For now, yeah.
For now, we'll leave it there. And I guess we'll see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.